My name is Amber, and I am 32. 11 years ago, I was a girl who had dreams bigger than the little town I grew up in. I remember the way the sunlight used to fall through the cracked windows of our old kitchen, the smell of my mother's perfume mixed with the faint odor of stale bread. That house held memories, both beautiful and painful. But to my parents, I was always the disappointment, the one who didn't measure up, the ugly high school graduate who would never amount to anything. My sister, on the other hand, was everything I wasn't. Or at least that's what they made sure I believed. She was beautiful, intelligent, charming, and the golden child. The one who deserved love, attention, and opportunities. The one who went to Stanford with my college fund, while I was told to pack my bags and leave. I remember the day they threw me out like it was yesterday. I had just graduated from high school, full of hope and excitement, ready to start college, ready to prove everyone wrong. But my parents saw it differently. "Amber," my father said, without a hint of warmth, "we think it's better for you to find your own path. You'll never fit into the life we want for this family." My mother didn't look up from her tea, her eyes cold and distant. My sister barely blinked, already wearing the smug little smile she had perfected over the years. I didn't understand then. I thought love and family were supposed to be unconditional, but apparently I had been mistaken. I spent the next few days wandering through the small town I had called home, dragging a suitcase that felt heavier than my heart. The reality was harsh. I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I stayed with friends who could offer only temporary shelter, and I took every odd job I could find: waitressing, dog walking, tutoring younger kids, anything that would pay a few dollars. I slept on couches, in cheap motels, and once for a whole month in my car. But despite the fear, the humiliation, and the loneliness, I refused to give up. I couldn't. I had this fire inside me, a quiet, relentless determination to prove them all wrong. College seemed impossible, at least at first. Without my parents' support, every door I tried to open slammed shut in my face. But I discovered something that would change my life: persistence. I applied for scholarships, grants, and work-study programs, sometimes multiple times a week. I learned to stretch a dollar, to negotiate, to stand tall even when I felt like I was crumbling inside. And slowly, opportunities started to appear. I worked my way through community college first, earning every bit of tuition and living expenses myself. Then, I transferred to a university that would later become the foundation of my success. During those years, I wasn't just surviving, I was learning, growing, shaping myself into a woman they could never imagine I could become. I studied business management, finance, and technology, fascinated by how ideas could turn into enterprises, how determination could turn into profit. Every evening, after a long day of classes and work, I would sit in my tiny apartment, staring at my reflection in the mirror, reminding myself who I was and who I wanted to be. "Amber," I would whisper, "one day they'll see." And for 11 years, I kept that promise to myself. There were hard days. Days when I cried in silence, missing my family, missing the childhood I would never get back. Days when I wondered if I had made the right choice to push forward rather than give in to despair. But each time I stumbled, I got back up, and I became smarter, tougher, more strategic. I learned about investments, about startups, about the power of networks. I learned how to turn a small amount of money into something significant. And gradually, I built a life that was entirely my own, one that didn't depend on approval or validation from anyone else. Meanwhile, back home, life continued without me, or at least I assumed it did. My sister went to college, graduated with honors, and started building her own life. I watched from a distance, curious but not bitter. I didn't need to keep tabs on them. My focus was on myself, but occasionally, I heard whispers, rumors about family milestones I wasn't invited to, achievements they proudly displayed to the world. Birthdays, graduations, even engagements. They moved on without me, as if I had never existed. And maybe in their minds I hadn't. Then came the call. It was my sister, or rather her fiancé. I didn't know him well, barely at all, and yet he somehow had my contact information. "Amber?" His voice was tentative, polite, almost nervous. "We're getting married, and I wanted to invite you. I know you and your family haven't been close, but..." He trailed off, unsure. And in that moment, something inside me stirred. 11 years. 11 long years of struggle, growth, and silent victory, and now they wanted me at their wedding. But this wasn't about reconciliation. Not yet. This was about presence, subtlety, and quiet impact. I agreed to come. Not to make a scene, not to seek revenge in the obvious dramatic way, but to exist in a space where I had once been invisible. I wanted them to see me. Not as the girl they dismissed, not as the embarrassment they had thrown out, but as Amber, the woman I had become, the force they could no longer ignore. I prepared meticulously, not to flaunt, but to embody dignity. My dress was elegant, understated, a reflection of who I was, confident, composed, and entirely in control. I didn't need their validation. I needed only to walk into that room and exist in my truth. The drive to the wedding venue was quiet. I watched the passing scenery, the familiar streets that had once been my prison, now feeling strangely irrelevant. I thought about my parents, my sister, the life I had left behind, and the journey I had undertaken. I thought about every late night, every rejection, every small victory that had built the person I was today, and I smiled, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep, calm satisfaction. I had arrived at this moment not by luck, not by inheritance, but by sheer will and perseverance. When I entered the venue, the atmosphere was charged with celebration. Friends, family, and colleagues mingled, glasses clinking, laughter floating through the air like music. And then I saw her, my sister. She was radiant, more beautiful than ever, glowing with happiness and anticipation. And yet, when her eyes met mine, there was a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. Confusion? Recognition? I didn't rush to greet her. I let the moment stretch, let the silence and subtlety speak louder than words could. Her fiancé noticed me first, I think. He approached, a polite but curious expression on his face. "You know her?" he asked softly as if testing the waters. I looked at him, my lips curling into a calm, almost imperceptible smile. And I said, quietly but with weight, "More than you think." It was enough. A simple sentence, but it carried the gravity of years, of struggle, of silent triumph. The room didn't explode with shock or drama. Instead, a subtle shift occurred. Heads turned, whispers began. Eyes that had never truly seen me were forced to acknowledge my existence, my transformation, my quiet power. And in that moment, I realized that revenge doesn't always need to be loud, confrontational, or cruel. Sometimes, it is the calm, deliberate act of being exactly who you were meant to be, showing up, and letting the truth of your presence ripple through the lives of those who underestimated you. Sometimes it is simply existing with grace, with dignity, with the quiet knowledge that you have won in ways they could never have imagined. The evening continued, full of laughter, dancing, and celebration. I moved through the crowd with ease, exchanging polite greetings, sharing smiles, maintaining a presence that was noticed but not forced. And everywhere I went, I felt the subtle weight of their surprise, their curiosity, their unspoken questions. My sister, for the first time in years, looked at me not as the sister they had discarded, but as a woman who had shaped her own destiny. And that, more than anything, was my quiet victory. I sat back at a corner table, observing the dynamics of the room, the interplay of relationships, the hidden anxieties behind polite smiles. I felt a calm satisfaction, a deep sense of fulfillment that no amount of recognition or applause could provide. I had lived, I had endured, I had succeeded. Not because they allowed it, but because I refused to be broken. And in that, I found my peace. The night was still young, and the story was far from over. But already I knew that this evening would mark a turning point. Not just for them, but for me. It was the beginning of a reckoning, subtle but undeniable, that would unfold in its own time. And I was ready, calm, composed, and powerful in my quiet presence. If you've ever felt underestimated, dismissed or overlooked by those who should have loved you unconditionally, remember this: the most profound revenge isn't loud, it isn't vengeful, it is living fully, triumphing quietly, and showing up in your own power. And sometimes, that is more than enough to leave a lasting mark. Before we continue, If you're enjoying this calm, deliberate story of personal triumph and subtle revenge, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might appreciate it, and subscribe for more stories that explore the quiet strength of coming back, standing tall, and claiming your own space in the world. I stayed at my corner table for a few moments longer, letting the room settle around me. The chatter, laughter, and clinking glasses were almost hypnotic. It was the sound of life moving forward, of milestones being celebrated. I let my eyes drift across the crowd, quietly noting familiar faces, the way people moved, how they interacted. I wasn't here to make an entrance or demand attention. My goal was far more satisfying: to exist in a space that had once excluded me, and to let my presence subtly speak louder than words ever could. People began noticing me. I could feel the glances, the quick, almost imperceptible turns of heads, and I smiled inwardly. I had changed. My posture, my demeanor, the quiet confidence I carried, it was all deliberate. 11 years of forging my own path had shaped me into someone they would never expect to see at their perfect little wedding. And yet here I was, quietly present, a calm ripple in the pool of celebration. My sister appeared across the room, radiant in her wedding gown, a delicate lace framing her face, her hair perfectly styled, and that same self-assured smile that had once made me feel invisible. She was laughing with her bridesmaids, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room. For a moment, I allowed myself to observe her without judgment, just taking in the sight of the girl I had once shared everything with. And then I noticed the subtle shift in her expression as our eyes met. It was barely perceptible, a micro-expression almost too quick to catch, a flicker of recognition, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was apprehension, maybe surprise, but it was there. I chose not to approach her immediately. I wanted the moment to unfold naturally, to let the tension build, to allow the unspoken questions in the room to form and linger. I knew that presence was a powerful tool, and I had become a master of using it. So I remained seated, letting the subtle energy of my existence ripple outward. People whispered, casting side glances at me, trying to place who I was. Some looked confused. Others seemed intrigued. The groom, my sister's fiancé, had already approached me once, and I could tell he had told someone else about me, though I didn't know who. The seed of curiosity had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. Then, the father of the bride noticed me. His eyes widened slightly, a small tightening of his jaw that betrayed his surprise. He didn't approach, not yet, but I could feel the tension in the air. He had always carried himself with a certain pride, an expectation that everyone in the family would follow the script he had written. And I had disrupted it simply by existing. He hadn't expected me to be at this wedding. 11 years had passed, and I was no longer the girl he had dismissed. The transformation was undeniable, and he couldn't ignore it. The next hour was a delicate dance of social navigation. I greeted distant relatives with polite nods, exchanged smiles that were warm but measured, and allowed myself to enjoy the quiet satisfaction of being recognized without having to explain myself. People tried to remember where they had seen me before, their minds scrambling to piece together the puzzle. I noticed the subtle shifts in conversations, the way topics changed when I entered a room, the way people leaned slightly closer as if trying to understand who I had become. And I smiled inwardly, because all of this was far more satisfying than any dramatic confrontation could have been. Eventually, my sister's bridesmaids approached me. They were polite, curious, and a little nervous, trying to gauge whether I was friend or foe. I introduced myself simply, with a calm confidence that disarmed their curiosity. "Hi, I'm Amber," I said, extending a hand with a subtle grace. Their smiles were tentative at first, but gradually they relaxed. One of them asked, almost hesitantly, if I had been in town long. I smiled. "Long enough," I said, letting the answer hang in the air. There was no need to elaborate. My presence alone said everything. As the evening progressed, I noticed the way people's attention subtly shifted toward me. My sister, for all her confidence, began to glance in my direction more often. I caught her once, mid-conversation with a friend, pausing as if trying to remember a detail from the past. She had questions she couldn't yet voice, memories she hadn't expected to confront. The room was alive with unspoken tension, and I watched it all quietly, savoring the awareness that I had become an enigma, a living reminder of the choices my family had made 11 years ago. Dinner began, and I found myself seated at a table not far from the bride and groom. I observed the interactions, the laughter, the toasts. I listened to conversations that ranged from mundane small talk to heartfelt recollections of family memories, noticing the subtle undercurrents of pride, insecurity, and hidden resentment. I could see the micro-expressions, the subtle cues that revealed how people truly felt beneath the surface. It was fascinating, and I allowed myself to quietly appreciate the perspective I had gained over the years, the wisdom that came from watching life from a distance. During one of the speeches, the best man mentioned family, making a few jokes about sibling rivalry. My sister laughed, as did the crowd, but I noticed the flicker of discomfort in her eyes when our relationship was referenced. She shifted slightly in her seat, glanced around, and then looked directly at me. For a moment, it felt like time slowed, and I could see the storm of emotions playing across her face. Curiosity, regret, confusion, maybe even a hint of fear. It was subtle, but it was there, and it was exactly what I had hoped for. The beginning of awareness, the first acknowledgement that I was no longer invisible, that I had grown into someone they could no longer dismiss. Later, as the night carried on, I found myself standing near the edge of the dance floor, observing the joyful chaos of dancing couples, friends laughing, and the occasional clinking of champagne glasses. The groom came up to me again, this time with a softer curiosity. "Amber," he said, "can I ask you something? Were you close to her when you were younger?" His voice carried genuine interest, tinged with a hint of caution. I smiled, maintaining the calm demeanor that had become my signature. "More than you think," I replied, echoing the words I had spoken earlier. His eyebrows lifted slightly, and he nodded, as if he understood there was more beneath the surface than he could possibly guess. It was fascinating to watch my sister's subtle reactions throughout the evening. She tried to maintain her composure, to smile politely, but there were moments when I caught glimpses of doubt, moments when her carefully constructed confidence wavered. The realization that her little sister, dismissed, disowned, and underestimated, had returned, elegant, composed, and self-possessed, was beginning to settle in. And I did nothing to accelerate it. I simply existed, letting the natural flow of recognition and acknowledgement unfold. At one point, I wandered over to the dessert table. A few guests were gathered there, chatting softly. One woman, a distant cousin I barely remembered, glanced at me and then leaned in slightly, curiosity evident in her tone. "Amber, you've changed," she said. I smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "I suppose we all do," I replied, calm and measured. It wasn't a boast. It was simply the truth. The room seemed to hum with subtle acknowledgement, an unspoken recognition of growth, of transformation, of the quiet power of perseverance. As the night continued, I realized that my presence was having an effect far beyond what I could have anticipated. Conversations shifted, questions were whispered, and glances lingered. I was no longer the forgotten, dismissed girl. I was a woman who had navigated life's challenges, built her own success, and returned with quiet dignity and presence. And that, more than any confrontation, any argument, or any overt display of success, was my subtle revenge. By the time the first dance began, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. I had entered this room as a shadow of my past, and now I was a presence that could not be ignored. My sister danced, radiant and joyful, yet I could see the occasional flicker of realization, the unspoken acknowledgement that the girl they had underestimated had returned in a way they could not have imagined. It was calm, it was deliberate, and it was entirely mine. Even as I observed the celebrations, I allowed myself a quiet reflection. 11 years of struggle, of resilience, of growth had brought me here, and while my sister's life had flourished in certain ways, and my parents had remained comfortably ensconced in their narrow expectations, I had something far more valuable: agency. I had created my own world, and I had returned to theirs not with anger, but with the quiet power of knowing my worth. And as the night drew on, I knew that this was only the beginning. The subtle unraveling of assumptions, the soft awakening to truths long ignored, would continue. I had planted the seeds, and they would grow in their own time. I would continue to exist, to be seen, and to remind them of the woman they had once dismissed. The woman who had taken the path they refused to believe in, and had returned stronger, calmer, and more formidable than they could ever imagine. If you're captivated by this story of quiet resilience, subtle presence, and the slow unfolding of long-awaited recognition, please like this video, share it with someone who might appreciate the journey, and subscribe for more calm, powerful stories of personal triumph and quiet revenge. The night was well underway, and the wedding had taken on that warm, chaotic rhythm that makes celebrations feel timeless. The laughter, the music, the gentle clinking of glasses, it all seemed to wrap the room in a comforting cocoon. Yet for me, nothing about this evening was ordinary. Each moment was an opportunity to observe, to sense, to understand the dynamics that had once left me on the outside. I moved quietly through the crowd, careful not to disrupt the festivities, yet fully aware of the subtle energy my presence created. My sister had become the center of attention, as expected, glowing in her gown and orchestrating the perfect balance between bride and hostess. And yet, every so often I caught her eyes searching for me, not out of curiosity alone, but out of a dawning realization. She had spent 11 years thinking I would fade into obscurity, believing I was lost to the world. And now, here I was, calm, composed, and undeniably present. I noticed the quick swallow she took when our gazes met, the slight stiffening of her posture, the fleeting hesitation before she turned back to her conversation. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. I drifted toward the bar, where a few of my sister's college friends had gathered. They didn't know me from high school. For them, I was simply Amber, an elegant stranger at the wedding. I greeted them with warmth, a gentle smile that invited conversation without forcing it. "Hi, I'm Amber," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. They returned the introduction with polite curiosity, some clearly trying to place where they had seen me before. I could sense their minds working, piecing together the puzzle, and I let them wonder. One of the women, a friend of my sister from Stanford, tilted her head slightly and asked, "Are you family?" I allowed the question to linger before responding, carefully measured. "Yes, more than you might realize." The subtle ambiguity, delivered with a composed tone, caused a pause. She smiled, unsure of whether she was being tested, but it was enough to seed curiosity. People were beginning to sense that I was someone with a story they weren't fully aware of. And that, in itself, was satisfying. Across the room, I noticed my parents seated at a corner table, engaged in polite conversation with distant relatives. My father's jaw tightened when he noticed me, an almost imperceptible twitch that betrayed his surprise. He had always expected life to follow his carefully drafted plan, and my appearance here, at my sister's wedding, defied that narrative. My mother's eyes widened slightly, and I caught the flash of recognition before she looked away, pretending not to see me. It was a subtle acknowledgement, but enough to make me realize that my presence was already beginning to disrupt the carefully maintained equilibrium they had constructed over the years. I wandered toward the seating area, passing by relatives I barely remembered. Some nodded politely, others paused mid-conversation, and a few whispered as I passed. It was curious, almost like a ripple moving through the water. The realization that the girl who had been dismissed, who had been written off, had returned. I didn't engage in any overt conversation. I simply existed in the space, calm and composed, letting the undercurrents of recognition and intrigue unfold naturally. At one point, my sister's fiancé approached me again, his expression more thoughtful this time. "Amber," he began, his tone quieter, more deliberate. "Can I ask, what have you been up to all these years?" There was genuine curiosity in his voice, tinged with the polite caution of someone aware that the answer could be complicated. I smiled softly, letting a fraction of the past shine through. "Life has been a journey," I said. "I've learned a lot, grown a lot, and discovered my own path." The words were simple, yet they carried weight. The pause that followed, the subtle nod he gave, the slight widening of his eyes. It was all evidence that the perception of me was shifting, slowly but undeniably. Meanwhile, I observed my sister as she moved through the room, interacting with friends and family. She was radiant, but there were moments where the tension was visible, subtle cracks in her composure when her eyes inadvertently met mine. It wasn't overt confrontation. It was more of a quiet internal reckoning. She had spent years believing that I was insignificant, that I would disappear, and now the reality was unavoidable. That internal struggle was fascinating to watch, the way someone could reconcile their expectations with reality, one subtle realization at a time. I found a quiet moment to myself near the balcony, looking out over the grounds of the wedding venue. The lights twinkled softly, reflecting off the water, casting gentle shadows across the lawn. I took a deep breath, feeling a calm satisfaction settle in my chest. 11 years ago, I had been discarded, dismissed, and left to navigate life on my own. I had faced rejection, hardship, and loneliness. Yet here I was, standing in this beautiful space, a witness to my own transformation. The peace I felt wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and entirely my own. A waiter passed by, offering a tray of champagne. I accepted a glass, raising it slightly in acknowledgement of the ongoing celebrations, then took a slow sip. I noticed my father watching from across the room, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. I didn't rush to him. There was no need. The realization of my growth, my presence, my success, it would come to him in its own time. Subtlety was far more powerful than confrontation, and I had learned the value of patience. The music shifted, and the first dance was announced. My sister took her position, radiant and poised, and the crowd gathered to watch. I stayed back, letting others move forward, observing the interplay of emotions. As she danced, I noticed the subtle ways people glanced at me, the occasional flicker of recognition or curiosity. I caught my sister's eye once, just for a moment, and held it with calm intensity. There was a question in her gaze, unspoken yet clear. Who had I become? What had I done with the years they thought would erase me? I allowed the moment to stretch, letting the silent acknowledgement convey more than words ever could. Later, as conversations shifted toward toasts and speeches, I found myself seated near a group of family friends. They didn't know my history, yet they sensed something different about me. I listened to their stories, their recollections of shared memories, and I allowed a small, gentle smile to form as I reflected on my own journey. The contrast was stark. They spoke of family milestones as if I had never existed, yet I was here, fully present, an embodiment of the years of perseverance and growth they had overlooked. One of the cousins leaned in, curiosity evident in her tone. "Amber, you've really changed," she said. I nodded, calm and composed. "Time changes all of us," I replied. "Some of us choose how we change." There was a pause, a brief moment of reflection in her eyes, and then she smiled, almost as if acknowledging a truth she hadn't considered before. And that, I realized, was exactly the subtle shift I wanted to create. The quiet awareness that the person they had dismissed was now someone they couldn't ignore. Throughout the evening, I maintained my composed presence, observing the ebb and flow of interactions. I noticed the subtle ways my sister's confidence wavered when our paths crossed, the slight hesitation in my father's movements when he glanced in my direction, and the flickers of curiosity in the eyes of relatives who had once taken my absence for granted. It was a delicate, quiet dance of recognition, and I allowed it to unfold naturally, savoring the slow but undeniable impact of my presence. As the night drew on, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The years of struggle, the countless nights spent working and learning, the perseverance through rejection and hardship, all of it had culminated in this calm, deliberate presence. And I realized that the most satisfying form of subtle revenge was not confrontation or drama, but the quiet, undeniable proof of one's own growth and resilience. I watched as my sister mingled with guests, laughing, radiant, yet occasionally glancing my way with that flicker of doubt I had come to recognize. The awareness that I had grown into a woman of independence, dignity, and strength was settling in for her, slowly but surely. And I knew that in this moment, I was no longer just Amber, the sister they had dismissed. I was Amber, the woman who had taken control of her life, who had built her own success, and who had returned to claim her place, quietly and deliberately. Even as the music played and guests danced, I allowed myself a moment of calm satisfaction. The subtle power of my presence had already begun to shift perceptions, to plant seeds of awareness that would grow in their own time. And I knew that this was only the beginning. The evening, the celebration, the interactions, they were all part of a larger tapestry, a careful orchestration of subtle revelations and quiet acknowledgement. Before we continue with the next chapter of this story, remember, true revenge is often quiet, patient, and deliberate. It doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. If you're following Amber's journey and appreciating this slow, calm unraveling of long overdue recognition, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who values stories of quiet triumph, and subscribe for more calm revenge stories that unfold with dignity and precision. The evening had settled into a rhythm of laughter, clinking glasses, and soft music drifting across the hall. But for me, the night was alive in a way it had never been before. Every interaction, every glance, every subtle shift in energy mattered. I had spent years preparing for this moment, not in a calculated, vengeful way, but by quietly building my own life, my own strength, my own presence. And now, the culmination of those years of effort was unfolding in real time, almost imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. I found myself walking along the edge of the dance floor, allowing the music to wash over me. The guests were immersed in celebration, but I was acutely aware of the undercurrents, the subtle tensions, and the micro-expressions that revealed more than the polite smiles could ever say. I could see my sister's wedding party interacting with ease, yet I noticed the small hesitations in their movements when their eyes flicked toward me. Curiosity, doubt, and a slight discomfort. These were the signs that my presence was creating ripples. And I allowed myself a small inward smile. I had come not to confront but to exist, and in doing so, I was already unraveling the narrative they had constructed about me. At one point, my sister walked past me, surrounded by her closest friends and her new husband, her radiant smile carefully maintained. But the moment our eyes met, there was a subtle hesitation, a small blink, a micro-expression that betrayed her surprise and recognition. She had thought of me as gone, insignificant, a chapter closed. And yet here I was, calm, composed, and undeniably present. I didn't approach her. There was no need. The unspoken acknowledgement between us was enough. Sometimes the quietest gestures carry the heaviest weight. I drifted toward the dessert table, where a small group of guests had gathered. They were speaking about the wedding, complimenting the decor, the food, and the music. One of them, a woman who had known my sister since childhood, glanced at me and whispered something to another guest, her tone curious. "Amber, she's not the same girl we remember, is she?" I allowed a gentle, almost imperceptible smile to form, and I replied softly, "No, I'm not." The words weren't meant to boast. They were simply a quiet truth, a reflection of years spent growing, learning, and becoming. I could feel the subtle shift in their perception, the way their curiosity deepened, the way they leaned in slightly, seeking to understand. Then my father's gaze met mine across the room. He was seated with a few relatives, attempting to appear composed, yet I could see the tightening of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, and the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders. 11 years ago, he had thrown me out, dismissed me, and used my college fund to send my sister to Stanford. Now I was here, not as a confrontation, but as a living testament to everything he had underestimated. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. The acknowledgement was already happening in the subtle language of presence. The music shifted again, signaling the beginning of a new dance segment. Couples paired off, laughter ringing out as friends and family twirled across the floor. I remained near the edges, observing, noting, understanding. And then, something unexpected happened. My sister's bridesmaid, a young woman I barely remembered from my teenage years, approached me with tentative curiosity. "Amber," she said softly, I didn't know you'd be here. You look amazing." Her words were careful, polite, yet there was an undeniable undertone of fascination. I smiled gently. "Thank you," I replied. "It's been a long journey." Her expression shifted, a flicker of realization crossing her face. She had known me as the girl dismissed by her parents, the one they had labeled as inadequate. And now here I was, transformed, composed, and fully present. It was a subtle form of impact, one that didn't require loud declarations or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes, simply existing, and doing so with quiet strength, is enough to shift perceptions irrevocably. As the night progressed, I began to notice a change in the room's energy. Conversations that had been light and casual now carried a subtle tension when I was nearby. Whispers arose, glances lingered, and the polite smiles that had once been automatic now seemed tinged with curiosity, maybe even unease. People were beginning to recognize that I was not the girl they remembered, that I had lived through challenges, and that I had returned with a presence that commanded acknowledgement. My sister, in particular, was a study in controlled emotion. She maintained her composure, smiled when expected and laughed when necessary, but there were moments when her eyes betrayed her, quick, fleeting glances that lingered just a second too long, a subtle stiffening of her posture, the occasional pause mid-conversation as if trying to reconcile memories with reality. She had built her life assuming I was gone, and now that assumption was quietly being dismantled. The realization I could see was uncomfortable, even disorienting for her. I decided to move closer to the center of the room, where the action was more concentrated. I greeted a few distant relatives, exchanging calm pleasantries, my tone measured, my presence composed. I noticed the subtle ways in which they reacted, some with curiosity, some with hesitation, others with barely contained surprise. It was a quiet victory, observing the impact I had without saying a word. People were reassessing, recalibrating, and acknowledging the truth of my transformation. The groom approached me again, his curiosity persistent but respectful. "Amber," he said quietly, "you really have changed. I can see the strength in you. How did you—" He trailed off, unsure of how to frame his thoughts. I smiled gently, letting a calm authority fill the space between us. "Life has its way of teaching us," I replied softly, "and I've learned to embrace every lesson." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of years lived fully, of challenges faced, and of personal triumph. He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation, and stepped away, leaving the subtle tension in the room to linger. At one point, I found myself standing near the entrance, where a small group of family friends and acquaintances had gathered. One of them, an older woman I recognized faintly from childhood gatherings, leaned in slightly. "Amber, your presence here. It's unexpected," she said, her tone polite, yet layered with meaning. I nodded calmly. "Life has a way of bringing people back, sometimes when least expected," I replied, letting the words carry both elegance and subtle power. She paused, her eyes reflecting a quiet acknowledgement, and then she smiled, an expression of understanding that I accepted without further comment. Throughout the night, I maintained this deliberate, calm presence. I didn't need to speak loudly or demand attention. I let the interactions unfold naturally, letting people realize on their own that the girl they had dismissed, underestimated, and forgotten had returned. I could feel the subtle shifts, the adjustments in posture, the flickers of doubt and curiosity, the unspoken questions forming in their minds. And I allowed it to happen, observing with a quiet satisfaction that came from years of deliberate growth and resilience. Then came a moment I had been anticipating, though I hadn't forced it. My sister approached me, her face composed, yet there was a subtle tension in her eyes. She smiled, polite and measured, but I could sense the internal reckoning beneath the surface. "Amber," she said softly, I didn't expect to see you here." Her words were carefully chosen, yet they carried the weight of years of assumptions, of dismissals, and of unspoken regrets. I returned her smile, calm and composed. "I know," I said softly. "It's been a long time." She nodded, her gaze flickering briefly away, then back. There was a question in her eyes, unspoken but unmistakable. Who had I become? What had I done with the years she thought would erase me? I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of presence and unspoken truth carry the impact. Sometimes the absence of words speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. The night continued, and I moved quietly through the room, observing the subtle ways in which my presence was reshaping perceptions. Conversations paused slightly when I approached, whispers trailed in my wake, and eyes lingered longer than necessary. I had become a living question, a presence that demanded acknowledgement without demanding confrontation, and that, I realized, was the most profound form of quiet revenge. As the evening drew on, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. 11 years of struggle, perseverance, and self-transformation had culminated in this moment of calm, deliberate acknowledgement. The room was alive with celebration, yet beneath it, subtle shifts were occurring, shifts in perception, understanding, and awareness. And I had created it all simply by existing, by being the person I had worked so hard to become. Before we continue with the next chapter, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful form of revenge is not confrontation, not drama, but the quiet, undeniable presence of someone who has grown, endured, and returned stronger than ever. If you're following Amber's journey and are captivated by this slow, calm unraveling of family dynamics and personal triumph, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates stories of quiet strength, and subscribe for more calm revenge stories that unfold with dignity and subtle power. As the evening wore on, the wedding hall had settled into that comfortable rhythm where celebration and intimacy intertwined. Guests laughed freely, danced gracefully, and exchanged toasts that celebrated love and family. Yet for me, this night was anything but ordinary. Every glance, every whispered question, every fleeting expression told a story that was unfolding silently, subtly, and in ways that only I could fully understand. I had not come here to interrupt their joy or to humiliate anyone. I had come to be present, to allow the truth of my journey to speak louder than any words could. I found myself moving toward the lounge area, where a quieter crowd had gathered. This was where older relatives, family friends, and those with a more reserved demeanor congregated, seeking a moment of calm away from the dance floor. As I approached, I noticed my mother sitting with a small group of women, her posture elegant but tense. Her eyes, sharp and calculating as always, flicked toward me. There was no recognition at first, only a faint tightening around the corners of her mouth, a subtle alertness that betrayed her awareness. She had thought I was lost, forgotten, a casualty of her favoritism toward my sister. And now here I was. I chose not to approach her directly. I didn't need to. The power of my presence was already working quietly, reshaping the dynamics she had assumed would remain fixed forever. Instead, I drifted past the group, exchanging soft smiles with distant relatives who now seemed to measure my every movement. There was a ripple effect, subtle yet undeniable, as the room adapted to the presence of someone they had once dismissed, underestimated, and written off entirely. It wasn't long before my sister noticed me again. She had been chatting with one of her bridesmaids, laughter spilling easily from her lips, but there was a noticeable hesitation in her posture when her eyes met mine. It was the micro-expression of someone suddenly forced to reconcile their memories with the present reality. A flicker of doubt, a shadow of uncertainty. I allowed it to pass without comment, letting the tension linger quietly. There was no need for confrontation. The acknowledgement alone was more powerful than any dramatic gesture could ever be. I moved to the side of the room where my father was now seated. He hadn't approached me, and I hadn't moved toward him, but the occasional glance between us was loaded with unspoken meaning. 11 years ago, he had dismissed me, cast me out, and used my college fund to send my sister to Stanford. Now, the trajectory of our lives had shifted in ways he could no longer ignore. The subtle tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible adjustment of his posture, all of it spoke volumes. And I smiled inwardly, recognizing the quiet impact of my existence in this space. A waiter passed by, and I took a glass of sparkling water, sipping it slowly as I observed the interactions around me. It was fascinating, really, the way people's perceptions began to shift, almost unconsciously, in response to my calm presence. Conversations paused slightly when I entered a room. Glances lingered, whispers circulated, and the air itself seemed to carry an awareness of the unspoken truths I embodied. I had grown into someone they could no longer dismiss, and the subtle realization of that fact was beginning to ripple through the evening in ways they couldn't yet articulate. Then came a moment I had anticipated, though I hadn't forced it. My sister, radiant in her gown, approached me, her expression carefully controlled yet undeniably complex. There was a polite smile on her face, but her eyes carried the weight of unspoken questions. "Amber," she said softly, her voice tinged with both curiosity and a touch of apprehension. I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Her words were measured, careful, but beneath them was a tremor of realization. I met her gaze calmly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to carry the weight of everything we had both lived through. "I know," I replied softly, my tone steady and composed. "It's been a long time." There was no accusation in my voice, no overt judgment, just calm acknowledgement of the years that had passed, the struggles endured, and the growth achieved. She nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, and looked away for a moment before returning her gaze to the floor. There was an unmistakable tension in her posture, a subtle acknowledgement of the imbalance that had existed for so long, and the new reality that now presented itself. My mother soon joined the interaction, her presence commanding attention even in a crowded room. She smiled politely, but the tightness in her eyes betrayed her inner calculation. I extended a calm, controlled greeting, and she nodded, offering the minimum acknowledgement required by social convention. There was no warmth, no genuine recognition of the woman I had become. But I didn't need it. My satisfaction came from the knowledge that she was aware, finally, of what she had underestimated. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was happening. As the evening continued, I noticed that whispers about me had begun to circulate more freely. Relatives and acquaintances who had once assumed I would never amount to anything were now speaking in hushed tones, their curiosity piqued, their assumptions challenged. Some questioned my absence, others remarked on my appearance, and a few speculated about my accomplishments. I let these murmurs unfold naturally, understanding that their growing awareness of my success and transformation was far more powerful than any direct confrontation. During a lull in the festivities, I found myself near the photo area, where guests were taking pictures to commemorate the night. A few of my sister's childhood friends approached, their expressions a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "Amber, wow, you've really changed," one of them said softly. I smiled gently. "Life has a way of shaping us," I replied, letting the calm confidence in my voice carry the subtle weight of experience and growth. They nodded, perhaps sensing that there was more to my story than could be conveyed in a brief conversation. The subtle reckoning was building, quiet, but undeniable. My sister moved past me again, her composure flawless, yet I could see the flickers of doubt in her eyes. She had assumed that I would disappear, that the years had erased me from their world. And now, confronted with my presence, my calm strength, and the undeniable evidence of my perseverance, she was forced to reconsider those assumptions. The tension was almost electric, invisible yet palpable, and it flowed through the room with every glance, every subtle gesture, every pause in conversation. At one point, my father finally rose from his seat and approached, though not directly toward me. He lingered nearby, watching me with a careful, measured gaze. 11 years of disappointment, rejection, and underestimation had given way to a subtle, almost reluctant acknowledgement. He didn't speak immediately, but I could feel the awareness in his posture, in the tightening of his jaw, in the brief narrowing of his eyes. The realization was slow, deliberate, and in its own way, profoundly satisfying. I decided to engage with a few distant relatives, those who had once known me casually, but had no real connection. I listened to their stories, contributed gently to the conversation, and maintained a calm, composed presence. Each interaction was an opportunity to demonstrate, without words of accusation, that I had grown, thrived, and succeeded in ways they had once doubted. The whispers continued, the glances lingered, and I felt the subtle shift in the room's energy as my quiet influence spread. The bride's father, my father-in-law, joined us briefly, offering polite remarks that carried more weight than I could ignore. He was cautious, as if testing the boundaries of propriety, and I responded with measured warmth, acknowledging his presence without overstepping. There was a subtle dance in his demeanor, a careful consideration of how to navigate my presence without disrupting the evening's formalities. And I allowed it, recognizing that power often lies in patience and quiet observation rather than confrontation. Later, I noticed my sister in conversation with a close friend, her laughter slightly forced, her movements deliberate. I could see the fleeting moments when her gaze flicked toward me, almost as if seeking reassurance, perhaps even understanding. The realization that I was no longer the girl she had dismissed, the one written off as insignificant, seemed to weigh on her subtly. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was there, undeniable, and profoundly satisfying. As the night deepened, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection near the balcony. The soft lights of the venue cast gentle shadows across the lawn, the music drifting faintly through the air. I took a deep breath, feeling the calm satisfaction of knowing that 11 years of struggle, perseverance, and self-determination had brought me to this moment. I was present, observed, acknowledged, and quietly reshaping perceptions without ever having to demand attention or force recognition. Before we continue with the final chapter, remember this: revenge doesn't have to be loud, aggressive, or confrontational to be effective. Sometimes, it is the quiet, deliberate presence of someone who has endured, grown, and returned stronger than anyone imagined. If you're captivated by Amber's journey and the slow, calm unraveling of family assumptions, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates subtle power, and subscribe for more calm revenge stories told with dignity and care. The night had reached that rare point where celebration and introspection intertwined. The hall was warm with laughter, the soft hum of music, the gentle murmur of conversation. Yet beneath it all, there was an undercurrent that I could feel, subtle but unmistakable. This was the moment where years of absence, perseverance, and quiet transformation converged. 11 years ago, I had been dismissed, labeled, and cast aside. Tonight, I was not only present but fully realized, and the awareness of that fact began to ripple through the room like a gentle, inevitable tide. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting my gaze sweep across familiar faces. My sister was radiant as ever, yet there was an unspoken tension in her posture whenever our eyes met. She smiled politely at her guests, engaged in conversation, laughed at jokes, but occasionally, her attention shifted toward me. I saw the fleeting hesitation in her movements, the way she paused mid-gesture, almost as if measuring herself against the woman I had become. It was subtle, but I could feel the impact of my quiet presence, the slow unraveling of assumptions that had long gone unchallenged. I approached the bar, where a small group of distant relatives were chatting quietly. They had known me in passing, but had little understanding of my journey. Their initial curiosity was now mixed with intrigue. "Amber," one of them said softly, "you're quite different." I smiled gently, letting the calm authority in my voice carry the weight of experience. "Life teaches us lessons in its own time," I replied. The simplicity of my statement carried an implicit truth they couldn't ignore. I had lived, learned, and grown while the years they assumed had erased me were full of perseverance and self-realization. From across the room, I noticed my father standing near a window, observing me quietly. He hadn't approached, and I had no intention of forcing the interaction. 11 years ago, he had made a choice, one that dismissed my potential and favored my sister. Tonight, his subtle glances, the tension in his shoulders, and the slight tightening of his jaw spoke volumes. He could no longer deny my presence or the evidence of my transformation. That was enough. I didn't need to speak to him, didn't need to explain myself. The quiet acknowledgement in his posture and gaze was the affirmation I had long sought. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, one that would bring the entire evening into focus. My sister, radiant and poised, approached me directly. Her steps were measured, her face composed, yet I could see the undercurrent of uncertainty in her eyes. 11 years of assumptions, dismissals, and forgotten promises hung between us, unspoken but palpable. "Amber," she said softly, almost tentatively, I didn't expect you to be here." Her voice carried politeness, but beneath it lay a flicker of the realization that her little sister, the one she had once overlooked, had returned fully formed, calm, and undeniably present. I met her gaze steadily, holding the moment without rushing, allowing the weight of our shared history to settle naturally between us. "I know," I said quietly, my tone calm and composed. "It's been a long time." There was no accusation, no need to explain or justify. My presence, my calm demeanor, and the quiet confidence I carried spoke louder than any words ever could. She nodded slightly, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the reality she had once ignored. And then she looked away, perhaps to gather her own composure, leaving the moment suspended in that subtle, powerful tension. My sister's husband joined us then, curious and perceptive, his eyes searching mine with a question that seemed to seek understanding without needing explanation. "Amber," he said quietly, You've changed, but I feel like there's so much I don't know. Were you always this strong?" I allowed a soft smile to form, calm and unhurried. "Strength is not always visible," I replied. "Sometimes it's built quietly, away from prying eyes, through persistence, patience, and learning to rise even when no one expects you to." His eyes widened slightly, understanding the layers beneath my words, and he nodded. That acknowledgement, subtle yet profound, carried a weight I relished in silence. As the evening progressed, I observed the room with a quiet satisfaction. Guests were beginning to speak in hushed tones, the whispers carrying the soft weight of curiosity, astonishment, and subtle admiration. People were noticing not just my appearance, but the aura of calm, deliberate power I exuded, the unmistakable mark of someone who had endured, grown, and returned fully realized. There was no need for confrontation. The truth was evident in every gesture, every glance, every carefully measured smile. A distant cousin approached me, their tone tentative yet laced with curiosity. "Amber, I don't understand. What have you been doing all these years?" I allowed a gentle pause, letting the question hang in the air long enough for them to sense the breadth of my journey. "Living," I said simply. "Learning, building, becoming." The words were soft, but the implication was unmistakable. I had not been idle or defeated. I had taken the road they never imagined I could. The silence that followed was acknowledgement enough. My sister watched from a few feet away, her composed smile now tinged with a subtle tension. I could see the flickers of thought crossing her face. The recognition that the girl she had dismissed, the sibling she had believed lost, had returned stronger, more confident, and undeniably self-possessed. And it was in that quiet recognition that the culmination of my quiet revenge took shape. Not in drama, not in confrontation, but in undeniable, serene presence. Then came a moment that felt almost cinematic in its quiet intensity. My sister's husband turned to me again, nodding toward the crowd. "Do you know them all?" he asked, gesturing subtly to the family gathered. I met his gaze calmly, letting a soft smile form. "More than you think," I said, my voice steady. Those words, simple yet layered, carried the weight of years of experience, endurance, and quiet reclamation. The acknowledgement in his eyes, the subtle pause, the realization of layers unspoken. It was the perfect encapsulation of what I had sought all these years. Even my parents could no longer ignore the shift. My mother, ever poised, maintained her carefully constructed smile, yet her eyes flickered with the faint trace of awareness, an acknowledgement of a reality she had long suppressed. My father's jaw remained tight, but the tension in his shoulders hinted at an understanding, silent, reluctant, but undeniable. I didn't need to confront them with words. The quiet proof of my transformation, my resilience, and my presence was all they needed to see. As the evening carried on, I allowed myself a rare moment of introspection. 11 years of struggle, rejection, and rebuilding had led to this calm, deliberate moment. I had returned not to humiliate, not to shame, but to exist fully, to claim my own space, and to let the subtle truth of my life speak for itself. And it had. The room, once a place where I had been invisible, dismissed, and underestimated, now recognized my presence, my power, and my worth. The final moments of the night were almost serene. Guests began preparing to leave, conversations slowed, and the energy softened. My sister approached me one last time before the evening ended. Her eyes carried something complex: curiosity, reflection, and perhaps a hint of respect. "Amber," she said quietly, "you've really changed. I can see it." I nodded gently, maintaining calm composure. "Thank you," I replied softly. "It's been a long journey." There was no need for further words. The acknowledgement in her eyes, the subtle weight of recognition, was more than sufficient. As I prepared to leave, I noticed the small, quiet shifts that had taken place throughout the evening. Whispers had circulated, glances had lingered, and assumptions had been subtly dismantled. I had not needed to confront anyone directly, to argue, or to make dramatic gestures. The quiet presence of a life fully lived, a journey undertaken, and a strength quietly earned had done what words could not. The room had recognized me for who I had become, and that was the true, serene victory. Standing at the exit, I took a deep breath, letting the cool night air wash over me. I reflected on everything that had brought me here: the rejection, the struggle, the perseverance, and the growth. I had returned not to disrupt but to exist, to show without drama that I had taken control of my own life, built my own success, and returned with dignity and quiet power. And in that presence, I had achieved everything I had quietly hoped for. The night ended with a calm sense of closure. My sister's wedding had been perfect, yet beneath the surface, subtle truths had begun to surface. The quiet power of presence, the deliberate reclamation of dignity, and the slow recognition of personal triumph had woven a narrative that words could never fully capture. I left not with anger, not with confrontation, but with a serene awareness that I had, at last, been seen. If you've followed Amber's journey from dismissal to quiet triumph, from absence to powerful presence, remember that true strength often lies in patience, resilience, and dignity. Revenge doesn't need to be loud or dramatic. It can be calm, measured, and profound. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share it with someone who appreciates subtle, powerful narratives, and subscribe for more calm revenge stories that unfold with precision, depth, and dignity.